It was a typical Thursday afternoon, and the small apartment was filled with a warm glow from the late sun filtering through the curtains. The day had stretched on endlessly, each hour blurring into the next, and Noah found himself caught in the monotony of it. The apartment was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic rising from the street below, the occasional bark of a dog, and the sporadic thud of footsteps in the hallway outside. Noah had spent the day in solitude, working from home, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the keyboard, the familiarity of his workspace. The desk in the corner of the living room, covered in scattered papers, a half-drunk cup of coffee sitting precariously near the edge, provided little comfort. It all felt mundane, like he was living on autopilot. The living room itself was small but cozy, filled with mismatched furniture that gave the place an eclectic feel. The sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting dappled patterns on the rug below. A few houseplants, their leaves stretching towards the light, sat perched on the windowsill, and a couple of art prints adorned the walls, a reflection of Noah's interest in abstract shapes and colors. Yet today, even the comforting familiarity of his surroundings failed to ease the sense of unease that had settled in his chest. Noah sighed, leaning back in his chair, his eyes drifting towards the window. Outside, the sky was a brilliant shade of blue, and he could see the tops of trees swaying gently in the breeze. It looked peaceful, but there was a restlessness gnawing at him from within, a strange heaviness that he couldn't quite shake. He rubbed his temples, trying to push away the thoughts that had been lingering in the back of his mind for days. Thoughts about Sam. It wasn't something he wanted to confront, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Sam had been living with him for almost 3 years now, ever since their parents got married. Their relationship had always been complicated, but not in any obvious or dramatic way. It was more the things left unsaid, the tension that seemed to build in the spaces between them. They never fought, not really, but there was always a distance, an invisible wall that kept them apart. And lately, Noah couldn't help but notice that distance seemed to be shrinking, the wall thinning, the air between them charged with something he couldn't quite define. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 4:15 p.m. Sam would be home soon. Noah could feel his heart rate quicken slightly at the thought, an involuntary reaction that left him feeling vulnerable. He didn't like how aware he was of Sam's presence, even when he wasn't there. It was like Sam had taken up residence in his mind, occupying a space that Noah wasn't prepared to give. He tried to brush it off as just the awkwardness of their situation. They weren't really brothers, but they lived together, shared meals, exchanged pleasantry, and yet there was something else. Something he was too afraid to acknowledge. Pushing himself up from his chair, Noah walked over to the kitchen, needing a distraction. He filled a pot with water, setting it on the stove to boil. Cooking always helped calm his nerves. The methodical process of chopping vegetables, stirring, tasting. It gave him something to focus on, something tangible. He pulled open the fridge, scanning its contents before grabbing some carrots, celery, and a couple of potatoes. He placed them on the counter, picking up a knife and beginning to chop. The rhythmic sound of the knife hitting the cutting board was soothing, a steady beat that drowned out his thoughts. The apartment was filled with the smell of simmering vegetables, the steam rising from the pot, fogging up the nearby window. Noah found himself lost in the process, his hands moving automatically, his mind quieting for the first time that day. He liked the simplicity of it, the way everything had a purpose, a place. There was no confusion, no mixed signals, no complicated emotions. Just the simple act of creating something from scratch. But as he stood there stirring the pot, he couldn't help but feel the familiar weight return, the sense that something was about to change. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you were about to fall but not quite ready to take the leap. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled him from his thoughts, the distinct, unhurried pace that he recognized immediately. Sam. Noah felt his breath catch for a moment, his hand pausing mid-stir. He didn't turn around, didn't need to. He could feel Sam's presence even without seeing him. The door opened, and Noah could hear the soft rustle of Sam's jacket as he hung it on the hook by the door. There was a pause, a moment of silence that seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. Noah kept his eyes on the pot in front of him, the steam rising in gentle spirals, his heart pounding in his chest. He heard Sam's footsteps approach, slow and deliberate, and he felt the air shift, the atmosphere in the room, changing the moment Sam entered. "Hey," Sam said, his voice breaking the silence, casual. Yet there was an undercurrent to it that made Noah's stomach twist. "Hey," Noah replied, glancing over his shoulder, offering a small smile before turning back to the stove. He could feel Sam's eyes on him, watching, and it made his skin prickle, a strange mix of awareness and unease. Sam moved closer, leaning against the counter, his presence filling the small space, making it feel even smaller. Noah could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken words hanging between them, and he wished he knew how to bridge the gap, how to make sense of the emotions swirling inside him. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he focused on the soup, stirring it slowly, the wooden spoon moving in circles, the vegetables bobbing up and down in the bubbling broth. Sam didn't say anything either, and the silence between them grew heavier, the weight of it pressing down on Noah's chest. He could feel his pulse quickening, his mind racing, trying to find a way to break the silence to ease the tension. But all he could do was stand there, his back to Sam, the warmth of the stove in front of him, the heat of Sam's presence behind him. It was overwhelming, the proximity, the unspoken emotions. And for a moment, Noah felt like he couldn't breathe. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The sound of the boiling water, the smell of the vegetables, the warmth of the kitchen. It was all too much, and yet not enough to distract him from the reality of what was happening. He knew that things couldn't stay the way they were, that something had to give, but the thought of confronting it, of facing what lay between them, terrified him. Sam shifted slightly, his arm brushing against Noah's, the contact brief, but enough to send a jolt through him. Noah's breath caught, his hand tightening around the spoon, his heart pounding in his ears. He wanted to move, to put some distance between them, but he couldn't. He was rooted to the spot, caught between the fear of what could happen and the desire to let it. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing in, the air thick with unspoken words. Noah finally turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of Sam out of the corner of his eye. Sam was watching him, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark and intense. There was something there, something that made Noah's heart skip a beat, a look that spoke of things neither of them were ready to say out loud. Noah swallowed hard, his throat dry, his mind a jumble of thoughts and emotions. He turned back to the stove, his hand moving automatically, stirring the pot even though the soup was already done. He didn't know what to do, how to navigate the space between them, the tension that seemed to grow with each passing second. All he knew was that he couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep ignoring the way his body reacted to Sam, the way his heart raced whenever Sam was near. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, and Noah knew that something had to change. He took a deep breath, his hand stilling on the spoon, his eyes fixed on the pot in front of him. He didn't know what was going to happen next, didn't know if he was ready for it, but he knew that he couldn't keep running from it. Whatever this was between them, it was real, and it was time to stop pretending otherwise. "The soup's ready," Noah said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, the words feeling inadequate, but it was all he could manage. He turned off the burner, the bubbling water settling into stillness, the steam slowly dissipating. He could feel Sam behind him, still close, still watching, and Noah knew this was just the beginning, that whatever was between them, it was far from over. Sam had been part of Noah's life for nearly 3 years, and in all that time, their relationship had remained ambiguous, undefined. They weren't close, but they weren't distant either. It was as if they existed in a state of limbo, somewhere between strangers and something more. The day Sam moved in, Noah remembered feeling both excitement and apprehension. He had been curious about this new person who was about to become part of his everyday life, and at the same time, there had been an unspoken fear, a fear that things would change in ways he couldn't control. The first few weeks had been awkward. Noah, being naturally introverted, had kept to himself, while Sam had tried to make himself at home in the new environment. There had been polite exchanges, awkward conversations over dinner, and the occasional shared laugh, but for the most part they had kept their distance, each trying to navigate this new family dynamic without stepping on the other's toes. Sam had always seemed comfortable at ease, while Noah often found himself second-guessing his every word, unsure of how to act around his new stepbrother. Over time, things had settled into a routine. They developed a rhythm, quiet mornings, Noah working from home, while Sam headed out to his job. Evenings spent watching TV or cooking together. It was all very ordinary, and yet, beneath the surface, there was always something else, something Noah couldn't quite put his finger on. He often found himself watching Sam when he thought he wasn't looking, studying the way he moved, the way he smiled, the way his eyes seemed to hold a depth that Noah couldn't quite understand. Noah knew he was drawn to Sam, but it was a feeling he tried to ignore. It was easier to pretend that what he felt was just a byproduct of their circumstances. Two people thrown together by their parents' marriage, forced to coexist in the same space. But deep down, Noah knew it was more than that. It was the way his heart seemed to skip a beat whenever Sam smiled at him, the way his skin tingled whenever they accidentally brushed against each other. It was the way he found himself thinking about Sam at the most random moments, wondering what he was doing, if he was thinking about him too. The realization that his feelings for Sam went beyond mere curiosity had been both thrilling and terrifying. It wasn't something he could easily admit to himself, let alone to Sam. There was too much at stake: their living situation, their families, the fragile balance they had managed to create. Noah wasn't sure he was ready to risk all of that, not for something that might not even be real. And yet, the more he tried to suppress his feelings, the stronger they seemed to grow. There were moments, fleeting, intense moments, when Noah was sure that Sam felt it too. The way Sam's gaze would linger on him a little too long, the way his voice would soften when they were alone, the way he always seemed to find reasons to be close to him, to touch him, even if it was just a hand on his shoulder or a brush of their arms. It was in those moments that Noah felt the tension between them most acutely, a tension that seemed to grow with each passing day. Noah often found himself replaying those moments in his mind, analyzing every word, every look, every touch, trying to decipher what it all meant. It was exhausting, this constant back and forth, the uncertainty of it all. He wanted to know, wanted to understand what was happening between them, but at the same time, he was terrified of what the answer might be. What if he was wrong? What if he was the only one feeling this way? The thought of that rejection, of losing what little connection they had, was enough to keep him silent, to keep him from taking that leap. And so, they continued on, day after day, existing in this strange limbo, neither of them willing to take the first step, to break the silence that hung between them. It was both comforting and maddening. This unspoken understanding. Noah found himself caught between wanting to push Sam away, to create some distance, and wanting to pull him closer, to feel the warmth of his body, the reassurance of his presence. It was a constant battle, one that left him feeling drained, his emotions a tangled mess that he couldn't begin to unravel. As the days turned into weeks, Noah found it harder and harder to ignore the growing tension between them. It was like a storm brewing on the horizon, inevitable and unstoppable. He knew that eventually something would have to give, that they couldn't keep going like this forever. But until that day came, Noah was content to live in the in-between, to hold on to the fragile balance they had created, even if it meant denying what he truly wanted. Sam's footsteps were always distinct. There was a deliberate steadiness to them, a kind of quiet confidence that seemed to announce his presence without needing words. Noah could often tell when Sam was coming down the hallway, just by the sound of his shoes on the floor. It was a sound he had grown used to, a part of the everyday background of his life. But lately, those footsteps had begun to carry a weight they hadn't before. Each time they approached, Noah felt his heart pick up pace, a subtle but undeniable reaction that left him feeling off balance. He remembered the day Sam had first moved in, the unfamiliar footsteps down the hallway, the sight of Sam's things being carried into the apartment. There had been a sense of intrusion, a shift in the space that had once been his alone. Noah had tried to be welcoming, tried to adjust to the new normal. But the truth was, it had taken time for him to get used to having someone else around. And even now, 3 years later, there were moments when Noah still felt like he was navigating uncharted waters, trying to figure out where he stood in relation to Sam. Sam was different from anyone Noah had ever known. He was confident, easygoing, always seeming to know exactly what to do or say. There was a calmness about him, a kind of natural charm that drew people in, and Noah had found himself drawn in too, almost against his will. He didn't want to be fascinated by Sam, didn't want to care so much about what Sam thought of him, but it was impossible not to. Sam had a way of making Noah feel seen, really seen, in a way that no one else ever had, and that scared him. Noah wasn't used to feeling this vulnerable. He had always been careful to keep his emotions in check, to keep people at a distance. It was easier that way, less chance of getting hurt. But with Sam, it was different. The more time they spent together, the harder it became for Noah to maintain that distance. There was something about the way Sam looked at him, the way his eyes seemed to hold a depth of understanding, That made Noah feel like all his defenses were useless. It was like Sam could see right through him, past all the walls he had built up, and that was both thrilling and terrifying. There were times when Noah found himself watching Sam, his gaze lingering a little too long, his mind wandering to places he knew it shouldn't. He would catch himself staring at the way Sam's hair fell across his forehead, the way his smile lit up his entire face, the way his hands moved with such ease and confidence. And every time, Noah would force himself to look away, to focus on something else, to push down the feelings that were becoming harder and harder to ignore. It wasn't just the way Sam looked at drew Noah in. It was the way he made him feel. There was a warmth to Sam's presence, a kind of quiet strength that made Noah feel safe, even when everything else in his life felt uncertain. Sam had a way of making even the most mundane moments feel special, of turning a simple dinner or a quiet evening into something that Noah found himself looking forward to. And that was the problem. The more time they spent together, the more Noah realized that he didn't just enjoy Sam's company. He craved it, but craving Sam's presence came with its own set of complications. Noah knew that what he felt wasn't something he could easily admit, not to himself, and certainly not to Sam. There was too much at risk, their living situation, their families, the fragile balance they had managed to create. And so Noah kept his feelings to himself, burying them deep, trying to pretend that everything was normal, even when it felt like anything but. It was the little things that got to him the most. The way Sam would brush against him when they were in the kitchen, the way his hand would linger on Noah's shoulder just a little too long, the way his eyes would meet Noah's across the room, filled with something that Noah couldn't quite decipher. It was in those moments that Noah felt the tension between them most acutely, a tension that seemed to grow with each passing day, until it felt like it was going to snap. Noah often wondered if Sam felt it too. If he noticed the way Noah's breath would catch whenever they were too close, if he could see the way Noah's hands would tremble slightly whenever they touched, it was hard to tell. Sam was always so composed, so sure of himself, and Noah envied that. He wished he could be as confident, as unbothered. But the truth was, he wasn't. He was a mess of emotions, his heart constantly at war with his mind. And he didn't know how much longer he could keep it all inside. The days turned into weeks, and the tension between them only grew. It was like a storm brewing on the horizon, inevitable and unstoppable. Noah knew that eventually something would have to give, that they couldn't keep going like this forever. But until that day came, Noah was content to live in the in-between, to hold on to the fragile balance they had created, even if it meant denying what he truly wanted. Because as much as he wanted to take that leap, to find out what could be, the fear of losing what they had was enough to keep him standing on the edge, too afraid to fall. The first argument they had wasn't even really an argument. It was more like a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control, the kind that stemmed from all the things left unsaid, all the tension that had been building between them. It started with something small. Noah had forgotten to do the dishes. He'd been caught up in his work, the hours slipping away without him noticing, and by the time Sam had come home, the sink was still full, the kitchen counter cluttered with unwashed plates and cups. Sam didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the mess, his expression unreadable, and Noah could feel the frustration radiating off of him. There was a heaviness to the silence that followed, a weight that settled over the room, making Noah feel small and defensive. He knew he should have done the dishes, knew he had let things slide, but the accusatory look in Sam's eyes made something inside him snap. "I was going to get to it," Noah said, his voice sharper than he intended. He hated the way his words sounded, the way they seemed to hang in the air, heavy and tense. Sam glanced at him, his eyes narrowing slightly, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, until finally, Sam shook his head, a sigh escaping his lips. "It's not just the dishes, Noah," Sam said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made Noah's chest tighten. Noah felt his heart sink at the words, a mix of confusion and hurt bubbling up inside him. What did that mean? It felt like there was more behind those words, something unspoken that Noah couldn't quite grasp. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he just stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, his mind racing. Sam turned away, his shoulders tense, and Noah watched as he walked over to the living room. the distance between them growing with each step. Noah wanted to follow, wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the gap that seemed to be widening between them, but he couldn't move. He felt rooted to the spot, his chest heavy, his throat tight. It was like all the words he wanted to say were stuck inside him, trapped beneath the weight of everything he had been trying to ignore. Evening passed in a blur after that. They barely spoke, each of them retreating to their own corners of the apartment, the silence between them deafening. Noah tried to focus on his work, tried to lose himself in the familiar comfort of routine, but his mind kept drifting back to Sam, to the look in his eyes, the tension in his voice. He replayed the moment over and over, analyzing every word, every glance, trying to understand what had gone wrong, what he could have done differently. But it wasn't just about the dishes. Noah knew that. It was about everything they had been avoiding, all the emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface, unacknowledged and unspoken. It was about the way they had been dancing around each other for months, neither of them willing to take the first step to break the silence. And now it felt like all of that tension had finally reached a breaking point, the fragile balance they had managed to maintain shattering in an instant. Noah lay awake that night, staring up at the ceiling, his mind a jumbled mess of thoughts and emotions. He could hear Sam moving around in the other room, the soft creak of the floorboards, the faint rustle of blankets as he settled into bed. The sounds were comforting in a way, a reminder that Sam was still there, that they were still sharing the same space, even if it felt like they were miles apart. But it wasn't enough. Noah wanted more than that. He wanted to bridge the gap, to reach out and pull Sam close, to feel the warmth of his body, the reassurance of his presence. But the fear held him back. The fear of rejection, of pushing Sam away even further, of losing what little they still had. It was a fear that had kept him silent for so long, a fear that had prevented him from taking the leap, from finding out what could be. And now it felt like that fear had finally caught up with him, wrapping itself around his chest, squeezing until he could barely breathe. The next morning was quiet, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Noah went through the motions, making coffee, preparing breakfast, but everything felt off, the familiar routine tinged with a sense of unease. Sam was there, sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes downcast, his expression unreadable. Noah wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just handed Sam a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly, the contact sending a jolt through him. Sam looked up then, his eyes meeting Noah's, and for a moment it felt like time stopped. There was something in Sam's gaze, something that made Noah's heart skip a beat, a depth of emotion that took his breath away. It wasn't anger, or frustration, or even disappointment. It was something else, something raw and vulnerable, something that made Noah's chest tighten with a mix of hope and fear. Noah opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, Sam looked away, his gaze dropping back to the table, the moment slipping away. Noah felt a pang of regret, a sense of loss that made his chest ache. He wanted to reach out to touch Sam, to hold on to that fleeting connection, but he didn't. Instead, he turned away, his hands trembling slightly as he busied himself with the dishes, the clatter of plates and cups filling the silence. The rest of the day passed in much the same way, quiet, tense, each of them caught in their own thoughts, the distance between them feeling larger than ever. Noah tried to focus on his work, tried to lose himself in the familiar comfort of routine, but it was impossible. His mind kept drifting back to Sam, to the look in his eyes, to the weight of everything left unsaid. He knew that things couldn't go on like this, that something had to change, but he didn't know how to take that first step, didn't know if he was ready to risk everything for the chance of something more. And so, they continued on, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing day, the tension building, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Noah didn't know what was going to happen, didn't know if they could find a way to bridge the gap between them. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep ignoring the way he felt. It was time to stop running, to face whatever lay ahead, no matter how terrifying it might be. Noah stood at the kitchen counter, his eyes unfocused as he scrubbed a plate that had long been clean. His hands moved on autopilot, but his mind was trapped in an endless loop of the past few days. The silence in the apartment was unbearable, thick with all the things neither of them had dared to say. It weighed down on him, pressing into every corner of the small space, and he could feel it slowly suffocating him. Sam had retreated to his room hours ago after a dinner spent in near silence. They had eaten together, but the tension between them had made every bite feel heavy, every word unnecessary. Noah couldn't remember what either of them had said. The conversation had been minimal, forced. He hadn't been able to look Sam in the eye, afraid of what he might see there, afraid of what he wouldn't. The plate slipped from his hand, clattering into the sink, and Noah winced at the sound. He stood there, staring at the water running over his fingers, feeling the warmth of it, but somehow disconnected from his own body. This couldn't go on. This stalemate between them. It was tearing him apart from the inside. Without thinking, Noah dried his hands and walked down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He stopped outside Sam's door, his fist hovering in the air, frozen by indecision. What if this was a mistake? What if opening this door only made things worse? But the alternative, continuing to live in this unbearable tension, wasn't an option anymore. Noah's hand fell, and he knocked, the sound echoing too loudly in the quiet apartment. There was a pause, and then Sam's voice came from the other side, low and tired. "Come in." Noah hesitated for just a moment before he pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small lamp on the bedside table. Sam was sitting on the bed, his back against the headboard, a book lying forgotten on his lap. His eyes lifted to meet Noah's, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The air between them crackled with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. Noah stepped inside, closing the door behind him, but remaining near the entrance. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't even sure what he was apologizing for. Everything, maybe. Only the distance, the confusion, the feelings he didn't know how to express. Sam's expression softened slightly, but there was still something guarded in his eyes. He set the book aside and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's not just about the dishes, Noah," he said, echoing the words that had haunted Noah since their argument. "I know," Noah admitted, his throat tight. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words. I don't know how to talk to you anymore." Sam's gaze flickered with something unreadable, something that sent a shiver down Noah's spine. "You never really tried," Sam said, his voice soft but not unkind. "You keep everything bottled up. It's like you're scared to let me in." Noah opened his mouth to protest, but the truth of Sam's words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been keeping everything inside, too afraid of what might happen if he let it out, too afraid of what it all meant. "I am scared," Noah said finally, his voice trembling with the weight of the admission. "I don't know how to feel about this. About us." Sam's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening for a brief moment before he spoke again. "What are you so afraid of?" Noah's heart raced, his pulse thudding in his ears. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't expected. "I don't want to lose you," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to ruin whatever this is, whatever we have, but He stopped, the words catching in his throat. But Sam's eyes softened, and Noah could see the tension in his shoulders easing. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of everything that had gone unsaid finally settling between them. "You're not going to lose me," Sam said, his voice quiet but firm. He stood from the bed, taking a step closer to Noah, his movements slow and deliberate. "But you have to be honest with me. With yourself." Noah's breath caught in his chest as Sam moved closer, the space between them shrinking until there was barely an inch separating them. His heart pounded, his pulse racing as he felt the warmth of Sam's presence envelop him. He could smell the faint scent of Sam's cologne, the familiar earthy notes that always seemed to calm him. And for a moment, all he could think about was how close they were, how much he wanted to close that final gap. "I don't know how to do this," Noah whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't even know what this is." Sam's gaze softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against Noah's arm, the touch sending a jolt through him. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now," Sam said quietly. "But you don't have to keep running from it either." Noah swallowed hard, his throat dry, his mind racing. For so long, he had been caught between what he wanted and what he feared, unable to move forward. But now, standing here with Sam, the weight of that indecision felt unbearable. Before he could second-guess himself, Noah closed the remaining distance between them. He reached out, his hands trembling slightly as he cupped Sam's face, his heart pounding in his chest. Sam didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, his eyes searching Noah's as if waiting for him to make the next move. And then, without another thought, Noah leaned in, pressing his lips to Sam's in a kiss that was both tentative and full of pent-up emotion. It was like the floodgates had finally opened, all the tension, all the unspoken feelings, pouring out in that single moment of connection. For a second, everything was still, and then Sam kissed him back, his hands finding Noah's waist, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, and Noah felt his heart swell with a mix of relief and something else, something that had been building for so long. It almost overwhelmed him. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathless, Sam rested his forehead against Noah's, his eyes closed. "We'll figure it out," he whispered, his voice steady, reassuring. Together, Noah nodded, his chest tight with a mix of fear and hope. He didn't know what the future held for them, didn't know how they would navigate this new territory. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of the uncertainty, because, for the first time, he wasn't facing it alone.